Welcome to Beer Thunder, the thing where I drink the beer and talk about the War Thunder. And you might be wondering, why am I faffing about in the Gripen at 101% throttle and testing for turn rate? And, dear viewer, thank you, I'm glad that you asked. And the real answer is, well, it's time to talk about the Gripen again, because I have not necessarily some new information, but I'm reconsolidating everything. And I want to talk about the flight model because I think that this flight model, understanding it, is inherently necessary to understanding the greater perspective of the game and where the game is basing its approximations of flight models on, and whether or not it's actually accurate, whether or not the current Gripen turn performance makes any aerodynamic sense. And thankfully, I can say that by the end of this, it actually does. There is a reason that it performs the way that it does, and there is a reason that it performed the way that it used to. Now, before I get to the end of the video, we have to start in the beginning, because my relationship to the Gripen is rather interesting, and the plane's a little bit old at this point. I think it's around 2 years old now, so you know the baby plane is now a toddler plane. So let's get to that. So for people that don't watch all of my channel and haven't seen my whole entire catalog of 200 videos, I have done multiple videos on the Gripen flight model. It has been one of my sources of consternation and one of my sources of, like, not necessarily like frustration, because I'm not really frustrated with the flight model. I'm more like frustrated with, like, every time something gets added to the game that nukes everything else, you get the fanboys that just say that, nope, that's the way it should be. Historical accuracy and realism is when I win at the game, and the more I win at the game, the better that it is. And when the Gripen was added, it was added in a state where it basically took everything in the game, planes like the F-16A, Block 10, and nuked them in 2 turns. The energy retention and the turn rate on this plane was absolutely insane. It was so insane, in fact, it kind of caused the whole entire rabbit hole and my obsession with aerodynamics in a way, because it did things that didn't make sense. It did things that didn't make sense on the surface, and I have a couple of videos covering that. And so in the beginning, it nukes everything because it retains giga speed, it has a better initial turn, and basically it just wins. And this causes a lot of arguments on the forums. And I start looking into it. And I start making posts on bleed rates. I start making posts on comparing the Mirage 2000, the F-16, the in-game Gripen, the MiG-29, basically anything that we can compare it to, because broadly speaking, all of these planes should have vaguely similar performance characteristics. Just adding a set of close-coupled canards on the front of a plane and then having a lower thrust-to-weight ratio isn't going to be magical. It's going to be beneficial, but it's not magical. And a lot of people on the forums defended it because obviously if you're good at the game now because you can push your S key, well, that's actually just a skill issue. And what happens over time is I make a couple of videos comparing the Gripen, its in-game performance, to the next closest thing that I can find. The next closest thing that I can find that has an actual EM diagram is the LAVI. And the LAVI EM diagram is sourced from a gentleman named John Golan, who made a whole entire book about the LAVI and what it's supposed to do, and actually calculated the performance. And I just use this as a baseline of, hey, this is what we think, this is what we can reasonably assume that a close-coupled canard plane with similar wing loading, similar thrust loading, in a similar configuration should meet for turn performance. And guess what? At the time, the Gripen was nowhere close. Not at all. Not even remotely like on the same planet. And that caused me to go down another rabbit hole, which was the John Golan aircraft performance videos. And at the time, I didn't really understand them. I didn't have the math chops to really go back and understand exactly what was going on. Anyways, what happens in the subsequent time is, in the background, there's a bunch of bug reports for the engine, the turn rate, and there's like a back and forth. Fans of the Gripen will say that the RM-12 should produce gigathrust and is basically ship-of-thesis into a completely new engine that is completely removed from the GE 404 engine that it's based on, and therefore it having gigatons of thrust beyond what even upgraded F-18 engine has is perfectly realistic. Because obviously, if it benefits me, that's good, and if it makes everyone else cope, that's bad. Also in the background going on the forums is like this dispute about how good the Gripen is in real life, where these claims about the Gripen going to red flag in 2006 and obliterating Eurofighters and obliterating the United States Air Force by playing Op 4 and just doing things better than everything get repeated. And it turns out that these claims are just from a message board called Quora, and they didn't happen. The primary source reporting from the Air Force at the time shows the Gripen went to red flag in 2006 in Alaska, and it operated on the Blue Force team. It operated with kind of the simulated NATO side, and they integrated pretty well, and they didn't shoot down any Eurofighters. And the reason that we know they didn't shoot down any Eurofighters is because none of the countries that attended red flag in 2006 operate Eurofighters. So how did it shoot down planes that were not there? And the real answer is, well, the claim was made up. The claim has no basis in reality. It was some guy who claims to have been in the Swedish Air Force, who was out of the Swedish Air Force at the time, and had no fucking clue what he's talking about. And those claims got picked up by some defense sites and repeated, where if you look up red flag 2006 in the Gripen, you're going to find, wow, this plane really went in and owned everything. Also, at the same time, the seeds of StatShark actually happen. Prey starts making his little program to pull out the CL and CD diagrams, the coefficient of lift, coefficient of drag diagrams from the game files, because while this is going on, we're all kind of scratching our head going, what the fuck is going on? Why is it this way? What is the Gripen? How is the Gripen? Why is the Gripen? Because not necessarily, oh, we're all coping, because most of us that have a lot of time in the game usually have more than one tech tree. I was not for playing the Gripen at the time when it was the best plane in the game. I played it a lot. I specifically went out to play it against other people in the Gripen just to show them how kind of inherently unfair it is, or see what happens to them when they get put on against a plane with the same capabilities. And a lot of people didn't like that. That's why I have like 900 bajillion games in the British Gripen. Oh, and I get banned from the forums for posting screenshots of Discord conversations containing Georgie Best, aka Slow Hand Clap, being vehemently racist against Israelis, Russians, and Japanese people. Apparently this was Nazism, and because I posted him doing a Nazi thing, I am banned from the War Thunder forums for 1,000 years. In the meantime, the Gripen receives multiple nerfs. Gaijin effectively increases the drag coefficient, which moves the sustained turn rate down by about 1 to 2 degrees per second, and British and Swedish mains are in shambles. And then the active radar homing missile update hits, and having only 4 radar missiles further reduces the relevancy of the Gripen. British ones especially, because the R-Darter are dog shit. The Gripen turn performance was so bad at this time that it barely lost to an F-16A Block 10 in AirRB 1 vs. 1. In fact, the plane was rendered so far irrelevant that by the time the final of the Air Superiority Tournament rolled around for the one that contained active radar missiles, that really only 6 out of the 8 finalists ended up playing the plane. Because as it turns out, actually, the new flight model was not really a gigantic limitation. It was still the second best flight model in the game, and having a bajillion countermeasures, especially in a smaller game mode, where securing the kills and getting high probability of kill missiles off was a little bit more important. So the Gripen wasn't actually rendered irrelevant. That was a little bit of sarcasm. To this day, the British are still lamenting about what was denied to them. The plane was basically rendered unplayable to this day because they are now required to point the lift vector in a generally correct direction to win against other planes, and periodic flares is no longer a sphere of invincibility. Fast forward to Christmas, skipping the small period of time where the J-10 was relevant, and all of the other Euro canards drop, and immediately they need to be buffed. They end up barely unseating the Gripper baby plane and the Block 10 for the best flight models in the game. This also marks the beginning of the Euro canard civil war, with the Rafale looking like it's winning with a constant stream of buffs while the Eurofighter remains largely untouched since the implementation of TWS+. RIP Priority Track, I hardly knew you. I don't think you're coming to the game. Also, I get banned on the forums again for evading the first ban. I was asking about a source for the claim that the Eurofighter is underperforming in sustained turn rate. It turns out that British mains really do not want you to see their documentation of the Eurofighter and what they are basing their claims on. This also means that we have to go through alternative methods of gathering information. It means essentially that in order to get the documentation, I have to astrally project myself into the British National Archives and claim the documentation for myself. Now, in reality, what we did is we sent a twink in to get it, and we have the documentation firsthand, and it turns out that the Eurofighter turn performance outperforms its own documentation by narrow to substantial margins depending on the testing parameters and what thrust values you end up assigning to the engine. Even when using the worst case predictions for engine thrust, it will outperform its own MOD prediction by just a little bit. Eurobummers will still insist that the Eurofighter is underperforming in terms of sustained turn rate. I keep asking for a source for these claims, and I get banned from the Datamine Discord. This is also about the same time frame that one of my Eurofighter video drops, where I actually showcase a lot of the documentation and go into the details of why the Eurofighter has been modeled with the turn rates that it has. At the same time, in the background, remember that we sent in a twink to the National Archives to get the documentation? Well, guess what? Sending in twinks works in a lot of other ways too, because we also send one to a German air show, and he actually gets to talk to a Eurofighter pilot and the ground crew. And what the pilot reveals is that, once again, substantiates the hard claim of 24 degrees angle of attack limit, and that the control laws of the plane basically don't allow it to stall. This 24 AOA limit doesn't hamper the plane, except in one circle fighting, but really, in all honesty, the pilot kind of iterates that HMD missile goes burr, and also the pilot iterates that the other Euro canards, i.e. the Gripen, ends up retaining energy actually pretty well, but they just end up crutching on their superior thrust to weight. Data on actual sustained turn rate is something the pilot just literally cannot answer. They're not allowed to. They can kind of like hem and haw about it, but they can't tell you that it's this, that, or otherwise. Also, at this air show, they did not bring a flight simulator, so getting any kind of reference numbers from a flight simulator is impossible. It's also not known whether or not, or to what extent, the flight simulator of the Eurofighter that they drag out to air shows mimics the one in real life, but that data would be nice to have, even though it is speculative. And this gets us to about 4 months ago, when Flame, one of the primary guys that handles the bug reporting and the sourcing for the Eurofighter, drops one of the greatest bug reports of all time, advocating for the nerfing of the Gripen sustained turn rate by around 3 degrees per second to make it line up with a document that he has that is comparing the Gripen to the ESRD requirements. Are you actually allowed to see this document? Am I allowed to see this document? Is anyone allowed to see this document except for the people that he deems acceptable to show it to? And the answer is no. There is no mention in the bug report whether or not the Gripen was the only plane compared to the requirement in the document. There's no mention whether or not the Gripen comparison is done in a vacuum, or if the comparison to the ESRD is done with other planes as well. There's no mention if the Gripen is based on numbers provided by Saab, or if they are done via calculation. Hypothetically speaking, what if we were able to scramble the Femboy Intelligence Agency and get our twink into the National Archives again and actually get a good look at this document? What if that document, hypothetically speaking, had multiple comparisons to multiple airplanes that we could then cross-reference and compare to the games in War Thunder? Hypothetically, it might look something like this. Hypothetically, there might be a bunch of planes in War Thunder that are underperforming or overperforming in terms of sustained turn rate according to the British MOD. Or we might be able to look at the sources in the document and look at the claims of sustained turn rate and cross-reference them with verified sustained turn rates to see the margin of error that the document might be off. But this is purely hypothetical, and we definitely don't already have this document. In the meantime, I go back to school, I learn some new algebra, and I learn how to create and brute force problems using Microsoft Excel. At the same time, I also gather and consolidate a lot of the coefficient of lift and coefficient of drag diagrams that I was able to find that are utilizing wind tunnel testing of scale models and simulations. I also go back and watch the John Golan Aircraft Performance Series in order to understand the equations that he is using in order to estimate the performance of the Lavi. And it's with this new understanding and with the information that I have gathered that I am able to start making my own performance predictions. What I am doing is I am using the specific excess power equation as specified in John Golan's video on aircraft performance, and then using the coefficient of lift and coefficient of drag numbers that are derived from the scale model testing to basically complete the equation along with information that the game provides you in order to accurately ascertain whether or not the bleed rate that we see in the game is accurate. What this equation will do is it will give you a specific excess power value as a function of your angle of attack and your lift to drag ratios. It will not give out a turn rate. However, if the coefficient of lift in the game and the wing reference area in the game corresponds to real life, then in theory, you will get the correct turn rate for the correct angle of attack. Now, let me cover this equation really quick, and I can't cover it quite in the way that John does in his videos, and I really do recommend that you watch those. But what you see on your screen starting from the left is PS. PS stands for specific excess power, in feet per second in this case. And what this equation is saying is that specific excess power is equal to your velocity multiplied by an output of all the stuff that is in the brackets in the parentheses. Within the brackets in the parentheses, you have your thrust to weight ratio multiplied by the cosine of the angle of attack, subtracting the load factor divided by the lift to drag ratio. Now, the way that I have this set up in Excel is I really just kind of plug all of these in. The real values that I am using are the thrust to weight value and the lift to drag value from the scale model, and then I'm using the outputs from War Thunder for things like thrust and things like angle of attack and velocity. Now, in order to get my numbers and get my predictions out of this equation, I had to go into War Thunder and I had to use WTRTI and basically do a set of turns and then pause the video and look at the listed thrust and whatnot to be able to kind of like fill in the blank. Because the way that this is organized in Excel is I have a bunch of columns and I fill in the parameters that I know, and then I fill in the parameters from real life, and then it auto-completes itself, and then I have an output, and I also have an output from the game to compare it to, because WTRTI will give you an output of things in specific excess power. Now, I did my testing at various throttle percentages, all the way from idle throttle all the way up to full throttle, full afterburner, just to get a general idea of how accurate the prediction is going to be to the performance that we see in the game. And as you see here, just kind of like starting from left to right, this is kind of like a convoluted mess. This is why I'm not showing it specifically in Excel, because I'm going to go back and redo this to be more elegant, more seamless. But our outputs for specific excess power from the calculation end up being on the left initially, and then they get bounced all the way over to the right. But our main inputs that we're getting from the game is going to be speed in kilometers per hour. That gets converted with a conversion factor, and that gets converted to feet per second. Our thrust and our weight, just because they are both in kilograms, it doesn't really matter because we are using the same units, so we will get like an accurate thrust to weight ratio. Our angle of attack is in degrees. The cosine, I've done that manually with a calculator to get the cosine of 25 degrees as opposed to doing it automatically with Excel, because it'll give you the cosine in radians, which means in the future I'll have to do a conversion from degrees to radians to cosine. And then load factors from the game, lift value and drag value is extrapolated from the scale model testing. And what happens is when I plug all of this into the specific excess power equation, I get a prediction in feet per second. I convert it to meters per second, and then I look at what WTRTI says at the time my specific excess power was, and that gives me like a general idea of like how accurate this prediction is with the real lift to drag curves versus the way the game has interpreted the flight model. Now, there are some weaknesses to doing it this way that I'm probably going to discover as time goes on. Specifically, wind tunnel testing doesn't take into account G-loading and how it affects the geometry of the plane, because once you put a plane under 10 Gs, the wings are going to sag, the shape's going to change a little bit. Some things that you get from the scale model testing and the simulation are probably not going to be perfectly accurate to the plane. Also, with the scale model testing and the simulation, they're modeling the plane as if the canards do not move. Basically, the scale model is stuck on a stick, and they blow air across it, and then they measure the coefficient of lift and coefficient of drag. And it means that essentially what is being predicted here is as if the Gripen is turning without utilizing its canard to reshape its airflow or control its center of gravity, which is going to change some things. But what this shows us overall, though, and what I've concluded, is that aerodynamically speaking, when you compare the Gripen in-game flight model and its bleed rates to what you would predict based on the coefficient of lift and coefficient of drag diagrams that I'm able to find, that overall it's reasonably accurate. You can kind of like step back, squint, turn sideways, and you're like, yeah, I can see that. For instance, if we just kind of like start from the top here, we get a turn of kind of a low speed turn of 384 kph, angle of attack 25, so very high angle of attack, a load factor of 3, and this is kind of like our minimum lowest sustained turn, more or less. And our in-game value of predicted bleed rate is minus 1/2 of a meter per second, whereas the calculation predicts that we should be gaining 1/2 a meter per second. So in this instance, it's underperforming a little bit according to the equation, and that's going to be one of the things that it's kind of prevalent throughout. Is like there'll be points where it underperforms, point where it overperforms, but kind of in broad terms, it's generally accurate. The only two outliers that I have as far as data is concerned is this third turn here at 779 with an idle power of 519. We end up with a predicted bleed rate of 469 meters per second, whereas in-game you get negative 392. That's a difference of 77.46 meters per second. That's like a pretty substantial difference. Some of these other differences at the bottom, especially when you get to lower bleed rate values, having a bleed rate that is radically different is going to kind of like throw things through a loop. The other thing that kind of throws things through a loop on these is the very high speed end of it, when the coefficient of lift and coefficient of drag values, because they correspond to, I think, a Mach 0.6 thing, where the values at, like, say, this last one at 1,200 kph is kind of corresponds to like Mach 0.9, where we get a predicted value of gaining 61.95 meters per second, where in game you actually have negative 51. But that's just using the kind of values that I have for like 11 degrees AOA and trying to massage those numbers through like a different calculator to try to get kind of like a general idea. And it's kind of rough. Like I'm kind of really suspicious of the way that the game handles specific excess power at those like Mach 1.0 values. So does this mean that the flight model is accurate? Yes, in some ways, and no in others. The best way to describe this is that it's probably the most reasonably accurate flight model the developer can approximate without further information or a more in-depth investigation. So if the plane is accurate now, and if the plane at least makes some semblance of aerodynamic sense, why did it overperform in the beginning? Well, what it appears to have happened is that Gaijin, with the initial Gripen release, more or less copied the correct coefficient of lift and coefficient of drag values from the same study that I am referencing, and just assumed that the outputs in War Thunder would be correct. They have then had to go back and adjust the coefficient of drag value to make the game engine match the predictions that a real-world equation would match. At least that makes the most sense to me. In essence, what this means is that Gaijin has modeled the Gripen as if the canards are fixed in place, and that it is pivoted by an invisible and dragless horizontal stabilizer. In order for Gaijin to get more accurate lift-to-drag values, they would have to account for the deflection angle of the canard throughout its entire flight envelope. I think this is something that might just be beyond the information that we have available. But for example, the game thinks that at 20 degrees AOA, the whole entire wing area of the Gripen is going through the air at 20 degrees. In reality, because of the way the canard works and because of the way that the canard has to balance maintaining optimal airflow over the wing, but also it's part of the stability regimen of the plane, where at some angles of attack, like especially at very high angles of attack, if you watch at air shows, the whole entire foreplane of the Gripen deflects downwards, and that's basically to keep the plane from tipping over backwards. This is all really just to say that the CLD or the CLCD numbers that are being used for this approximation are not entirely accurate, and it means that there's going to be some inherent inaccuracy that is just baked into the flight model. For instance, at very high angles of attack, when that canard is deflected fully downwards, you no longer have a 25 meter squared wing, you now have a 20 meter squared wing providing that lift, and that might mean that in-game your low-speed turn performance might be a little bit exaggerated. Likewise, there's also areas where not modeling the canard is going to hurt the Gripen. All of this is to say is that it's probably close enough. At least it's close enough for government work. Speaking of government work, let's get back to that British report on sustained turn rate. Because now that we have assessed that the Gripen at least makes aerodynamic sense and that its performance makes sense in-game, how come the British math department, with all of its maths, did not figure out how to math? Why is the British MOD prediction so far off from the performance that we see in-game? And the problem with the British assessment is that we do not know what the Brits were using as their underlying assumptions about the plane. But I will hazard to make an educated guess. This is why you saw me faffing about with sustained turn rates at the start of the video. If we assume that the flight model is aerodynamically sound in terms of coefficient of lift and coefficient of drag values, and that the reference wing area is correct, the only place that we can reduce sustained turn rate is by reducing the engine power. And that is what you saw me doing there, trying to figure out the power settings where the Gripen will meet the British calculation without having to alter the in-game coefficient of lift, coefficient of drag values, or alter the weight in-game. In order to get it to match the data point in the bug report, the installed thrust of the Gripen would have to be reduced by around 20%. The closest that I can approximate this is by running 101% throttle. Is this unreasonable? I don't necessarily think so. And the reason that I don't think so is that Gaijin has effectively given the Gripen its static thrust number as its installed value. Technically, if you use General Electric as a reference and use that 18,100 pound number and then cross-reference it with StatShark, the installed thrust loss of the Gripen is only around 2% at very low speeds. This is also not an issue that is unique to the Gripen either. The F-18C actually has an installed thrust value that is higher than its static thrust value, something that is physically impossible. For reference, in the game, the F-16C appears to have an installed thrust loss value that is roughly 17% lower than its static value. One of the things to keep in mind is that installed thrust values will always be lower than static thrust values. Whenever you constrict the airflow to a jet engine, it's going to reduce its thrust. And anytime you have to siphon off air or power in order to run a bunch of other systems, you're also going to end up losing thrust. In all likelihood, the British calculation probably makes a prediction on installed thrust based on uninstalled thrust and is accounting for that thrust loss. This discrepancy would also be compounded by the fact if they started their baseline assumption with the thrust values of an earlier and lower thrust F-18 engine. So it is entirely reasonable to believe that the British calculation is more accurate than what we see in game, but it's also reasonable to believe that maybe the British are underestimating the total thrust of the Gripen engine, because maybe at the time they just didn't know that the RM-12 is a slight upgrade over the baseline F-18 engine. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with potentially a much higher understanding of how the Gripen flight model has been calculated and the reasons for its overperformance in its earlier iterations. It also gives us a much clearer idea of how the developers have had to modify the drag values to get the game engine outputs to match real calculations. This is something that I find useful in and of itself. It also gives us a general idea of why it might still currently overperform in other metrics. I have not looked too deeply into this, but it would not be particularly surprising given the information that we already know. For what it's worth, I did run a good number of 1 versus 1s in the Gripen with a power limit set to 101%, which would bring its turning performance in line with what the British report calculates it to be. On paper, it would make the Gripen sustained turn rate worse than that of the F4FIs. In practice, the Gripen still ends up being quite formidable against things like the F-16C, but it does mean that its lower power to weight ratio is something that would be more readily exploited. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that the MOD calculation is perfectly accurate. With the way that Flame protects this source, I kind of do have my doubts. I think it is likely that the British MOD has made assumptions based on an earlier engine and then assumed some thrust loss from that earlier engine, which may skew their calculation to a lower prediction. So what does this mean for the current Gripen? Well, it's kind of a Frankenstein plane that at least has some kind of basis in aerodynamic reality, at least as far as turn performance is concerned, and as long as you accept the fact that the canards are modeled as if they are fixed in place. So what would make the plane more accurate to its real-life counterpart? Number one, just reducing the installed thrust and giving it an actual thrust curve that grows with speed is probably a good step in the right direction. As near as I can tell, the plane does meet its maximum straight line acceleration as specified in an Air Merching document the Gaijin has used as a reference. This means that as near as I can tell, its thrust to drag value near Mach 0.9 is probably correct or even slightly low. However, as I said earlier, this is not an issue that is unique to the Gripen. The other improvement would require having to simulate and analyze the canard positions as a function of AOA and then recalculate the coefficient of lift and coefficient of drag curves. Basically, Gaijin needs to become an airplane designer. The problem with making these changes, or really just advocating for them in general, is that a change to one thing is likely to throw off all of the other variables, i.e. if you put an engine in it with a plausible amount of thrust loss and a plausible thrust curve, it probably no longer meets some of the acceleration claims, which means that you then have to go back and adjust the drag values, which in turn changes the turn performance, etc., ad infinitum until the heat death of the universe. Would I like to see this done? Personally, yes. I think flight model accuracy for the sake of itself is worthwhile. Is it actually a good use of developers' time? No, probably not. So let's talk about the fights as well, because what I'm modeling in the background is the F-16C versus the Gripen limited to 101% throttle, which gets us really close to the British predicted values of the turn performance of the Gripen. And even in this case, the Gripen, with its coefficient of lift, coefficient of drag, and sufficient airframe, is still slightly better than the F-16C. Its ability to really cut in the early turns and get a lot of position up front and then ride behind a guy at low speed is something that doesn't really go away with the predicted thrust loss. At the same time, the Gripen's ability to retain speed at higher speeds and lower AOAs means that it really does end up hitting way above the weight class that you would expect the EM diagram to foretold. What this kind of means is that if they did, in the hypothetical hellscape of the Gripen gets nuked from low Earth orbit because the Eurofighter mains want every other canard flight model to be worse than theirs, it would still be plenty viable in a lot of the situations that you would find yourself in. We did these duels kind of back and forth where Poulette Badul, aka Pookie, started in the F-16C because I thought the F-16C was going to win. I thought 101% throttle, kind of losing 20% of your thrust, was going to be a big deal for the Gripen, and it'd be something to be kind of readily exploited. And we actually switched because in the Gripen I was winning too quickly, and I wanted to see what the results would be from the opposite end of the perspective. And even on the opposite end of this, the Gripen, no matter what, still has hands, especially when it utilizes kind of vertical ascending and descending maneuvers. It means it's able to kind of gain position on you. It also means that in a more kind of faithful representation of what the plane would do in real life, that some of the anecdotes that you read would be a little bit more plausibly true, where the Gripen is really good at cutting corners. It's really good for what it is, but also its thrust to weight ratio is kind of seen as like overall its Achilles heel. But even in this case, trying to utilize that Achilles heel against it is not something that is like readily achievable consistently every time. Yes, there's going to be some kind of line where the F-16 merges and then goes up and takes the Gripen all the way up to where it stalls out and then it dies, and it'll be a way to consistently beat it. It's also something that other planes can do, but it's also something that's not going to be all that common. Realistically speaking, this would move the Gripen down the dueling tier list to be kind of on par with more or less maybe the J-10, the Mirage 2000, a little bit better than the F-16C, and a little bit worse than the AMRAAM carrying F-16A. Now, fortunately for you, or unfortunately for me, this turn rate nerf is not going to happen. This bug report has already been denied and basically thrown in the trash. So I think for now, the Gripen performance is going to remain the same as it currently is. Anyways, that is really going to be all that I have for you for Beer Thunder. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you guys felt like you learned something. I hope you guys feel like I'm not wasting your time with these longer flight model centric videos, because they do take a good bit of effort to make. They do take a good bit of effort to kind of square all the corners, dot the I's, and get to an end result that I feel is at least reasonable. Anyways, in the words of the decider, George W. Bush, watch this drive.